I cheated with our wedding's best man, and my husband found out on our anniversary. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. My name's Laura Gutierrez, and for a long time I thought I was a good person simply because I never had bad intentions. Now I know one thing has nothing to do with the other. You can genuinely love someone and still destroy their life out of selfishness, emotional emptiness, or not knowing how to control yourself. I learned that too late. I was born in Portland, Oregon, but moved to San Francisco when I was 14 because my mom got a job there after my parents' divorce. My childhood wasn't terrible, though not especially happy either. My parents argued a lot, but never explosively. Theirs was worse. Long silences, constant tension, indifference. I grew up seeing two people coexisting in the same house like exhausted colleagues, more than a couple. And I think that marked me more than I understood for years. My mom always said I needed attention all the time. She'd say it half-jokingly, but it was true. Since I was a child, feeling ignored affected me greatly. If I was happy and no one noticed, I'd get frustrated. If I was sad and didn't receive immediate comfort, I felt like no one cared about me. I lived very dependent on how others looked at me, how they reacted to me, if I still sparked interest or emotion. Over time I learned to disguise that pretty well. I became that kind of woman who seems very self-assured, sociable, elegant, funny when I wanted to be. I knew how to enter a place and adapt quickly. I knew how to converse, how to make people comfortable, but behind all that was a constant need for emotional validation I never managed to resolve. When I finished university, I started working in advertising, first on small projects and then at a major agency in San Francisco. I liked feeling my life moving fast because silence made me uncomfortable. When I wasn't busy, I thought too much, and when I thought too much, insecurities I didn't know how to handle started appearing. My relationships before Pablo were intense and exhausting. I always ended up getting involved with emotionally complicated men, the kind that make you feel desired one day and the next seem to emotionally disappear. And the worst part is I confused that with passion. I believed suffering, doubting, or feeling constant anxiety was a natural part of falling in love. So, after several relationships that ended badly, I started convincing myself I needed something different. I no longer wanted unpredictable men or extreme emotions. I wanted stability, and that's when Pablo appeared. I was 27 and completely absorbed by my work. There were days I'd wake up feeling tired before even getting out of bed. That's why Pablo impacted me so much from the start, because he seemed exactly the opposite of everything I'd known. He didn't need to impress anyone, he didn't talk loudly, he was calm in a way that almost disconcerted me. There was something very firm about him, as if his feet were perfectly planted on the ground while I'd been living emotionally disorganized for years. And I think a part of me fell in love with that before even falling in love with him. I met Pablo on a completely normal afternoon, and that's precisely why I remember that day so clearly. Nothing spectacular happened. There wasn't a romantic scene or a movie moment, but something in that first conversation immediately stuck with me. I'd left the office late after a horrible meeting with a client. I was exhausted, annoyed, and had a headache. I went into a small bookstore near Market Street because I didn't want to go home to my empty apartment yet. I always did that on bad days, walk aimlessly and go into quiet places to quiet the mental noise a bit. The bookstore was almost empty. I remember the smell of coffee mixed with old paper and soft music playing in the background. I was browsing some books without paying too much attention when I accidentally knocked an entire pile to the floor trying to take one from the shelf. I quickly bent down, embarrassed, and another person did the same at the same time. It was Pablo. We ended up talking right there for several minutes. He wasn't trying to impress me with money, contacts, or exaggerated stories. He simply talked because he genuinely liked what he did. That caught my attention immensely. I was used to people who constantly needed to prove something. Pablo didn't seem to need external validation to feel secure. There was something very stable in his way of behaving. We continued talking inside the bookstore for much longer than normal. We talked about cities, how fast living in San Francisco felt, old movies, even how exhausting the work pace was in certain professions. And as we talked, I started to notice something that made me feel comfortable immediately. Pablo really listened. He didn't just wait for his turn to speak. He paid real attention to what I said. He remembered details, asked questions because he genuinely wanted to get to know me.
That was new to me.
When he finally asked for my number, he did it in such a simple way that it completely disarmed me. "I'd just like to see you again, if you're interested." And I was much more interested than I admitted at the time. Our first date was a week later. We went to a small Italian restaurant in North Beach. The conversation flowed easily. He told me about his childhood, how he always wanted to design spaces because he was fascinated by the idea of creating places where people could build lives. And throughout the night, I felt something very strange for me, tranquility, because Pablo was clear. If something amused him, he laughed. If he wanted to know something, he asked. If he liked spending time with me, he showed it without games. We kept seeing each other constantly after that. He started appearing in my routine very naturally. Sometimes he'd wait for me outside the office to have dinner together. Other times he'd bring me coffee when he knew I was working too much. He never made exaggerated gestures, but he was always present. And slowly I started to feel that for the first time in a very long time I was with someone who didn't hurt me emotionally. That's what made me fall in love. Not the intensity, not the mystery, not the drama, the peace. The first few months with Pablo were strange for me, but not in a bad way. Strange because I was used to relationships where there was always uncertainty, tension, or a constant need to prove something. With him, on the other hand, everything seemed to progress with a naturalness that at first even scared me. We never had that kind of dynamic where one disappears to make themselves desired or where every argument turns into an emotional war. Pablo was incredibly stable. If he said he was going to call me, he called. If he made a plan with me, he didn't cancel at the last minute. If he noticed I was exhausted or in a bad mood, he didn't take it personally, nor did he try to make drama around it. We started seeing each other constantly. First it was 2 or 3 times a week, then practically every day. I was still living alone in a small apartment near downtown San Francisco, and Pablo had a much quieter one in Pacific Heights. Little by little I started spending more time there without realizing it. I left clothes, makeup products, my charger, small things that slowly became permanent. And he never seemed uncomfortable with that. On the contrary, there was a very silent feeling that I already belonged there. Living together began even before we officially talked about it. I already had a key to his apartment. He knew my schedule perfectly, and I knew his. On weekends we went grocery shopping together, cooked, went out with friends, or just stayed home without doing too much. It was an adult, solid relationship. One of those that from the outside seem easy, though in reality they require a lot of emotional care to stay healthy. When we finally decided to move in together, there wasn't even a big dramatic conversation. It was more a logical consequence of everything else. We found a beautiful apartment in a quiet area of San Francisco. It had huge windows, an open kitchen, and a small balcony from which you could see part of the city. Pablo was obsessed with natural light, and I with making the place feel cozy. We spent entire weeks choosing furniture, colors, and decorations, as if we'd been building a life together for years. And honestly, that's how it felt. Living with him did me good in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. In the midst of all that, Eduardo appeared much more constantly. I already knew him because Pablo had talked about him a lot, even before officially introducing him to me. They'd known each other since university and were the kind of friends who practically function as family. When I finally met him, I immediately understood why Pablo loved him so much. Eduardo was completely different from him, much more extroverted, quicker to speak, more spontaneous. While Pablo conveyed calm, Eduardo filled spaces with energy. He was one of those men who make people feel comfortable almost automatically. The first time the three of us had dinner together, I ended up laughing all night because Eduardo had an absurd knack for telling stories. Pablo even seemed different when he was with him, more relaxed, more spontaneous, and I liked that. I liked seeing Pablo happy. Over the next few years, Eduardo became a constant presence in our lives. He came to dinner, showed up on Sundays to watch sports with Pablo, accompanied us on short trips. He even helped during our move. It was impossible not to grow fond of him because he really was charismatic. When Pablo proposed to me, we'd been together for almost 4 years. It was during a trip to Oregon, near a lake lost among mountains. Nothing exaggerated or prepared like a romantic movie. That was precisely Pablo's essence. I cried a lot, not only from the emotion of the moment, but because for the first time in my life I felt someone was offering me real stability, not fleeting intensity, not momentary desire, a home. And I accepted, completely convinced I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. Organizing the wedding was probably one of the happiest and most exhausting stages of my life at the same time. I'd always been extremely detail-oriented, so I turned the planning into a personal obsession. I wanted everything to be perfect. The music, the flowers, the dress, the lighting, the tables, even the exact tone of the invitations. We decided to have the wedding in Napa Valley because we both wanted something elegant but intimate. Not a gigantic ceremony full of people out of obligation. We wanted something warm, close, beautiful. The months leading up to the wedding were intense. I was still working a lot, and Pablo was entering one of the most important projects of his career. Even so, we found time to plan everything together, and Eduardo was present practically throughout the entire process. He helped a lot, more than I expected. He went with Pablo to some wedding-related meetings. He organized much of the bachelor party and constantly showed up to help us with logistical details or simply to keep us company when we were stressed. Pablo trusted him so much that many times he didn't even ask twice before giving him important responsibilities. And honestly, Eduardo was incredibly attentive. The wedding day was perfect. I still think it was the happiest day of our relationship. The vineyard was lit with warm lights. The weather was perfect, and everything looked exactly as I'd imagined for months. I remember seeing Pablo waiting for me at the end of the aisle and feeling immense tranquility. Not nerves, tranquility, as if I was finally arriving at the right place. And Eduardo was there, standing next to Pablo as his best man, smiling proudly. After the wedding came real life, and that's where the silent changes began that I didn't know how to handle correctly, because marriage didn't destroy our relationship all at once. There wasn't a big immediate conflict. Everything was much slower and more dangerous than that. The feeling that there was nothing new to discover anymore. And in the midst of that tranquility, I started noticing more and more the difference between Pablo and Eduardo. The first few years of marriage with Pablo were calm in a way I would have once thought impossible for me. And when I say calm, I don't mean cold or empty. On the contrary, there was love, respect, real affection. Pablo was still the same attentive and stable man who'd made me fall in love in that bookstore. He still left my coffee ready in the mornings when I had early meetings. He still asked me how my day was even if he came home exhausted from work. He still touched my back softly when he noticed I was stressed, even if I insisted on saying I was fine. But over time, stability started to become something silent, predictable. Our routine became extremely ordered. We woke up early, had breakfast together, worked all day, had dinner watching a series, and slept. On weekends, we went shopping, visited friends, or went to restaurants we already knew by heart. And although all that should have made me feel grateful, a part of me started to feel restless. It wasn't boredom exactly, it was something harder to explain, as if my life had stopped moving emotionally, as if everything was too controlled. And that part of me that always needed to feel intensely alive reappeared. Eduardo was still very present in our lives, very much so. He came to dinner several times a week, showed up unannounced to watch games with Pablo, accompanied us on short getaways, and was practically part of our routine. Sometimes we even joked that he only needed a key to the apartment, and the more time I spent with him, the more I started to notice things I'd deliberately ignored before. Eduardo had a very different way of relating to me. Pablo gave me security. Eduardo made me feel observed. There was a constant intensity in his way of speaking to me, even when he was saying completely normal things. He paid attention to me in a much more emotional way. He noticed minimal changes in my mood. He remembered small comments I'd made weeks earlier. And the worst part is he started telling me things that connected directly with my deepest insecurities. One night after dinner at home, Pablo fell asleep early because he'd been exhausted from work for days. Eduardo, and I stayed drinking wine in the kitchen talking about whatever. The conversation started completely normal, but at some point he asked me, "Are you happy like this?" I perfectly remember looking at him because the question made me very uncomfortable. I replied something automatic, something like, "Of course I am." But he kept observing me with that calm expression that seemed to analyze more than I was saying, and then he let out something that stuck with me. "Sometimes I feel like you're trying to convince yourself you don't need more excitement in your life." I should have gotten angry. I should have cut the conversation right there, but I didn't because deep down there was a part of me that felt incredibly understood. And slowly I started waiting for those moments with Eduardo, his messages, his jokes, his ambiguous comments. Nothing was explicit yet, but we both knew something strange was growing between us. I started dressing up more when I knew he'd be there. I started overthinking small things he said, and the worst part is I still deeply loved Pablo at the same time. That's something that was very hard for me to accept later. I didn't stop loving my husband to be unfaithful. I was simply selfish. I wanted to keep one man's stability while enjoying the excitement another provoked in me. And once I crossed that emotional line, everything started to deteriorate slowly, even if from the outside we still seemed like the perfect couple. The first time Eduardo kissed me was after a small argument with Pablo. I don't even remember exactly why we argued. Something domestic, insignificant. But I was sensitive, frustrated, feeling emotionally disconnected. Eduardo had come to drop off some work stuff for Pablo, but Pablo hadn't arrived yet. We stayed talking in the living room, and I ended up telling him more than I should have about how I'd been feeling lately, about the routine, about the feeling of being trapped in a life too predictable. And Eduardo listened to me exactly the way I needed someone to. Then he got too close. There was an awkward silence, and then he kissed me. I still remember the exact feeling of that moment, because a part of me immediately knew I was destroying something irreparable, but I didn't pull away, and that was the true point of no return. After the first kiss, everything became much easier to justify. We started texting constantly. At first they were ambiguous messages, then completely emotional conversations, then planned encounters with ridiculous excuses. And meanwhile, Pablo kept blindly trusting both of us. That's what torments me most now, when I remember everything. The calm with which he left us alone, the naturalness with which he spoke of Eduardo as his brother, the absolute trust he had in us. And yet I kept going. Our 4th wedding anniversary fell on a Saturday. Pablo had been planning something special for weeks because lately we'd been too busy, and he wanted us to spend time with the closest people we loved most. He organized an intimate dinner at home. Nothing exaggerated, just some close friends, good food, and wine. Of course, Eduardo was invited, and honestly by that point, our relationship was already completely emotionally unsustainable. We'd been seeing each other secretly for months. We'd crossed every possible boundary. And although we never seriously talked about leaving Pablo or starting something formal between us, the tension was already unbearable. I lived constantly divided between guilt and desire. Every time I looked at Pablo, I felt a horrible mix of true love and absolute shame.
Because he was still good to me.
He still cared for me the same. He still talked to me about the future as if everything was perfectly fine, and I lied every day. The night of the anniversary, I remember feeling strangely nervous since I woke up. There was something odd in the air, though I couldn't explain what. Pablo was especially affectionate. He cooked practically all afternoon, played music, opened wine, and even gave me an album with photos of our years together. When I saw him smiling at me as he handed me that gift, I felt like throwing up from guilt because I knew perfectly well what I was hiding. During dinner, I tried to avoid looking at Eduardo too much. We barely exchanged words. There was an obvious awkwardness between us, though probably no one else noticed it, or at least I thought so. Dinner ended late. Friends started leaving one by one until finally only Pablo and I were left tidying up the house. And then it happened. I can still recall every detail with sickening clarity. The sound of water running in the kitchen, the empty glasses on the table, the strange silence of the house after so many voices. I was putting away dishes when Pablo said my name. Not angry, not yelling, just Laura. I turned and saw him sitting at the dining table with my phone in his hand, and in that instant I understood everything. I don't know exactly how he discovered the messages. I think I'd left my phone unlocked after a notification, or perhaps he already suspected beforehand. Honestly, it doesn't even matter anymore. The important thing is he knew everything. I remember being paralyzed as he looked at the screen with an expression I'll never forget. It wasn't immediate rage. It was something much worse. Devastation. The face of a person whose world has just been destroyed before their eyes. And when he finally spoke, he said something I still hear in my head constantly. Tell me it's not Eduardo. He didn't even ask if there was anyone else. He asked specifically about him because I think deep down he never would have imagined a worse betrayal. I couldn't answer, and that silence was enough. Pablo started going through the messages in front of me. Complete conversations, photos, plans, lies accumulated over months. Every silent second in that room felt unbearable. I tried to talk, I tried to explain myself. I cried. I said I was confused, that I never wanted to hurt him, that I still loved him. But as I spoke, I realized something horrible. None of that mattered anymore. Because not only was I unfaithful, I did it with the man who stood by his side on our wedding day, the man who held our glasses during the toast, the man he'd called his brother for over 10 years. And I think that's what truly broke him. Pablo never yelled, never insulted me, never lost control. That made it even worse. He just looked at me with utterly destroyed eyes and said almost in a whisper, "Losing you is already enough, but losing him too just finished me off." And honestly, I think it was at that moment that I first understood the true magnitude of what I'd done. The divorce was fast, not because it was easy, but because Pablo stopped fighting for anything related to me the moment he discovered the truth. I think something inside him broke too deeply to try and fix it. In the following weeks, the house became unrecognizable. There were no longer arguments or dramatic scenes. There was something much worse. Absolute distance. Pablo barely spoke to me, slept in the guest room, or simply stayed working late to avoid seeing me. And I walked around the apartment feeling like a stranger in the life I'd destroyed. The most tense thing happened a few days after the anniversary. Eduardo showed up at the house because Pablo had written to him saying they needed to talk face to face. I didn't want him to come. I was afraid of how Pablo might react, because even though he was never an aggressive man, the pain he was carrying was already too great. And honestly, for a moment I thought it was really going to end very badly. I remember Pablo opening the door and seeing Eduardo standing there, unable to even meet his gaze. There were a few seconds of unbearable silence before Pablo simply exploded. I'd never seen him like that. He yelled that he was a traitor, that he'd treated him like family for years, that he was by his side on one of the most important days of his life while sleeping with his wife behind his back. Eduardo tried to speak, but Pablo pushed him as soon as he got too close. It wasn't a huge fight, but there was that moment when I thought they were really going to hit each other. And I think Pablo wanted to, not just for me, for himself, for the humiliation, for the double betrayal, for everything, but in the end it didn't escalate. Eduardo didn't react aggressively either. He stood there taking all of Pablo's rage practically in silence. And sincerely, I think that was even sadder because it didn't seem like a fight between two men. It seemed like the funeral of a lifelong friendship. After that, Pablo completely cut off contact with him, blocked his number, stopped responding to messages, and eliminated anything related to Eduardo from his life. And he did the same emotionally with me. We signed the divorce months later in a quiet office where we barely exchanged words. Everything was cold, fast, definitive. The last time I saw him, before each of us went our separate ways, I thought of telling him so many things. To ask for forgiveness again, to explain myself better, to tell him that I really had loved him, but in the end I didn't say anything because I understood too late that there are mistakes that don't just destroy a relationship.